In a swap, you have two counterparties. One of them is a fixed rate payer, the other is a floating rate payer. The fixed rate is the swap rate. So if I'm the fixed rate payer, I'm going to take the swap rate multiplied with the notional. So every year I'm going to pay $50,000 on this. The floating rate payer is going to pay the notional times the forward rate. Okay. And the net fixed. In fact, the way you do these things, you just pay the gap. So fixed rate payer minus floating rate payer. I mean, they're all positive, but because this thing is too high, let's make it 4. Yeah. Anyway, that's the net fixed. Okay. And present value of net fixed NPV function, which calculates present value of stream of cash flows that starts with the year 1, but you discount it at the swap rate. And these. Of course, in this case, present value of net fixed is negative. So if the swap rate is 4%, you want to be a swap rate payer, okay? Or fixed rate payer. What we need to do is, assuming I haven't made a mistake, data, what if analysis, goal seek, make that PV of net fixed 0 by changing the swap rate. Turns out the proper rate to do is 454 and something. So every year the fixed rate payer is going to pay 45,434.50, but will receive a floating amount. And the floating amount is 1 year forward, because we don't know what the 1 year rate is going to be 1 year from now. So on the first payment, we use the current 1 year rate. On the next payment, we're going to use forward rate from year 1 to year 2, because that's our best guess of what the rate is going to be given the current yield curve. Then, you know, as the forward rates change, obviously the swap rate is going to change. And originally, the fixed rate payer is going to be a net payer the first 5 years, but after that, it's going to be a net receiver. You know, that kind of has to happen. Otherwise, present value of those would not have been 0. So at the swap rates, neither side has an advantage. So the net value of the swap is 0. Of course, as interest rates change in the future, that's not necessarily going to stay at 0, because you already committed to that swap rate. So if you had a floating rate exposure in a foreign currency, well, first do a fixed to floating interest rate swap or floating to fixed, just like this one. Then your exposure, you're a fixed rate payer now in that currency. Your exposure is simply from one currency to the other. Then you do a currency swap. That's why I wanted to treat them separately. And this is a great way of managing your long-term interest rate exposure. I mean, a lot of firms borrow, especially in Europe, on a quarterly fixed to floating rate basis, but they don't want to take that risk. The market is a lot better on the floating rate part because whatever the basic uh, interest rate reference is, you just add a spread that is commensurate with the credit risk of the company, and that's it. Do your swap, you know, Patel is my swap bank, and I tell him, okay, I have an exposure where I have to pay floating rates, but I don't want to. How about we do a deal? You pay me the floating rate, and I pay you a fixed rate that we're going to agree. That rate is that swap rate. Suddenly, my exposure, even though I borrowed in floating rate terms, my net exposure is fixed. In a different currency, to convert it into my own currency, I'm going to do what you want to call fixed to fixed cross currency swap, which we cover next time. Now I don't have to worry about managing this interest rate exposure using short-term instruments like STIR futures, short-term interest rate futures. It's done, and bank is gonna do it. Is gonna run a swap book anyway. Some of their customers want to be floating rate payers for whatever their reasons is. Some people do it for the purpose of speculating. Suppose I think that interest rates are going to go up. Do I want to be a fixed rate payer or a floating rate payer? And I have no exposure. So I want to do a swap with my bank, and I tell them I want to be a fixed rate payer. Because if I think interest rates are going up, I will pay a fixed amount now for the next 10 years, but my bank is going to pay me the floating, which I think is going to go up. If I think interest rates are coming down and I want to speculate, I'm going to be a floating rate payer. Because what I agreed to pay, I expect to go down. So you can even use these to make speculations. In fact, a lot of people do. Yes.
But once you agree on the swap rate, it stays
It's fixed.
for the whole duration.
Yep. It's fixed. That swap rate is fixed for the next 10 years. I mean, if you want to change your situation, you have to do another deal either with your own bank or with some other bank that reverses. Suppose I did this 2 years from now, I decided, well, interest rates are going to go back up again. Originally, I speculated that they were going to go down. So I became a floating rate payer, and I'm going to get fixed rate. But 2 years from now, I decided, oh, interest rates are going to go back up. So I'm going to do an 8-year swap, either with my bank or another bank, basically to close the position. Now I'm going to pay fixed and get floating. Okay? But my floating, they cancel each other because I pay floating on one swap, I'm getting floating on the other swap. So those cancel each other out. The difference between the swap rates, that's going to be my net profit or loss, depending upon what it is. So you can even use another swap to close your swap positions. When these things first started in early 90s, you put the most experienced fixed income traders on these things. Now only junior traders are running these things. Because you build a spreadsheet like that, the damn thing runs itself. In fact, originally, we used to calculate these starting with the spot curve. And from the spot curve, we kind of, not kind of, we calculated a forward curve. Using that, we calculated the swap rate. Now, if you have the so-called swap curve, which means swap rates for 1 to 10 years maturities, from the swap curve, you can reconstruct the forwards. It's called bootstrapping. And from the forwards, you can reconstruct the spot curve. And the swap market is so deep these days, it's actually the swap market that determines what should happen in the spot market. I mean, these are arbitrary relationships. So if you know the swap curve, you can figure out what all the spot curves or forward rates should be. Otherwise, there is arbitrage. Again, if this was a master's level class, I would have actually shown you how to do it. It's not too complicated. You just need to be careful. It's kind of a this here we went from year 1 to year 10. Over there, you go to year 10, you come back. Because the difference between the swap rates of 10-year and 9-year determines those forwards. And once you know the forwards, that determines the spot, yada, yada, yada. Let's stop here today. Monday, I'll kind of do an overall review and, just ask me anything you want, or I'll do a general review. And Wednesday, we have the exam. And I'll post your homework towards midnight tonight.